Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our combined Sunday school classes, the Agape class and the Young Men's Bible class from First Presbyterian Church here in Greensboro. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and I thank you for joining us today as we gather online for worship and study on this, the fifth Sunday of Easter, Sunday, May 2nd. Our Sunday school teacher, Sandie Gravett, will join us in just a few moments as she continues her new series, From Bondage to Covenant, Exodus, and Becoming a Resurrection People. She's taking a look at how the early Christian church observed Eastertide, these 50 days between Easter and Pentecost, and what it can teach us today. First, let's sing a hymn together. The hymn today, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, God of Glory, Lord of Love. The text was written in 1907 by Henry Van Dyke. He was a professor of English literature at Princeton University, and he was also a Presbyterian minister. He said he was inspired to write this poem based on the beauty of the Berkshire Mountains, as he was serving as a guest preacher at Williams College in Massachusetts at the time. Our choir director, Dr. Robert Wells, likes to call this a happy tune, full of joy and optimism. And I should point out, however, that it was written just before the outbreak of World War I, in a time of despair and very little optimism. The hymn has certainly become one of the best-known hymns in the English language. The tune that's associated with this poem, Joyful, Joyful, has its own title. It's called Hymn to Joy, and it was adapted by the British organist Edward Hodges some 60 years before Van Dyke wrote the words to Joyful, Joyful. It was taken as an adaptation from Ludwig van Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the final movement. Henry Van Dyke reportedly wrote the words with this tune in mind. I'll put the words up on the screen for you and invite you to sing along with me, joyfully, as we sing, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee.
Joyful, joyful, we adore Thee, God of glory, Lord of love. Hearts unfold like flowers before Thee, opening to the sun above. Melt the clouds of sin and sadness, drive the dark of doubt away. Giver of immortal gladness, fill us with the light of day. All Thy works with joy surround Thee, earth and heaven reflect Thy rays. Stars and angels sing around Thee, center of unbroken praise. Field and forest, vale and mountain, flowery meadow, flashing sea, singing bird and flowing fountain, call us to rejoice in Thee. Thou art giving and forgiving, ever blessing, ever blessed, wellspring of the joy of living, ocean depth of happy rest. Thou our Father, Christ our brother, all who live in love are Thine. Teach us how to love each other, lift us to the joy divine. Mortals join the happy chorus which the morning stars began. Father love is reigning o'er us, brother love binds man to man. Ever singing, march we onward, victors in the midst of strife. Joyful music leads us onward in the triumph song of life.
As we continue our study this week on the wilderness wandering from Egypt to Sinai and what it teaches us about being resurrection people, I am struck by a single line. To get there, however, we need to remember something about last week. Recall, if you will, how the people were moaning to Moses about bringing them out in the middle of nowhere to die. We saw Moses reassure them that God had things under control. But today, there is an abrupt shift. The question we are going to encounter focuses in on Moses, and we are going to discover that he remains more than a little ill at ease with being a leader, much less a guide and an intermediary between the people and God. Before we get to this interaction between God and Moses, I want to remind us of some larger currents in the story with regard to their relationship. We need to think back about how being the leader of this bunch was not a role that Moses either sought or one that he relished. And it was an identity that still did not fit easily at this point in the story. I need to highlight this point because we can tend to think of Moses as a kind of ancient superhero. He is, in our minds, often a strong and resolute presence as the one who gives the law. And he can strike us as a bold and powerful and fearless figure. We can neglect to recognize that we are talking about a human being here. We can forget that he had a troubled childhood marked by violence against Hebrew male infants and growing up within a family where he knew he did not belong. It was confusing for him as he came to understand who he was. We can overlook his troubled youth, his impulsiveness, and even a murder charge that is correctly leveled against him. We can neglect to recognize that he marries a woman whose father takes him in while he is out wandering, but he never really feels comfortable in that family or in that place, and even names his firstborn son Gershom, stranger there. While we might remember his resistance to the call of God, we can fail to appreciate the difficulty of going toe-to-toe with the Pharaoh, and then the problems he had gathering together and leading a people who was not quite certain of him, of where they were going, or of even why they might want to follow. And looking ahead, we sometimes don't recognize the level of difficulty he encountered every time the people slid back into bad habits, idol worship, or grousing. Or we can forget the fact that Moses dies, much as he lived, without ever knowing any sense of permanence in his life. He never makes it to a home. He never enters the promised land. With all of these things in mind, it can read a little harshly when we see God's words to Moses in Exodus 14:15, Part A. "Why do you cry out to me?" God says. "Speak to the people of Israel, and they will pull up, pull out, go forward." The thing to notice in this passage is that the text does not report anything about Moses speaking to God or crying out to God in these circumstances. The people of Israel have cried out to God according to the previous section, but not Moses. Still, in 14:15, we find a second masculine singular pronoun. That is, why do you, Moses, cry out to God? Is there something missing here? Some scene where Moses speaks to God asking for an assist? Or is God blaming Moses for the people not yet being confident and crying out every time they feel in some sort of danger? There are no immediate or even nearby words that indicate why God is speaking to Moses in this way. But I want to explore the two possibilities I've just outlined. First off, it would not be beyond the pale to think that Moses did some belly aching we do not have reported, because that action is not inconsistent with the pattern of interaction between God and Moses elsewhere. I think of chapter 4 at the burning bush, when Moses is expressing his reluctance to go to the people and to do what God has instructed, to bring them out of Egypt. You will remember, I know, how Moses throws every excuse in the book at God for why he should not have to do such a thing, and then finally says, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." Or consider Exodus chapter 5. After Moses and Aaron encounter their first obstacle, Moses wonders why God has ever bothered to send him. And of course, there is the whole story of wonder after wonder that God permits Moses and Aaron to perform that ultimately allows the people to come out of Egypt. Almost every time, Moses has to be told exactly what to do to put God's power on full display. Perhaps by this point in the story, our narrator thinks that Moses should have known what God could accomplish and what he, as a representative of God, was empowered to do. There's been enough of a history between the two at this point to at least make us question why it is so impossible for Moses to assume this role. Shouldn't Moses have built up some confidence in God and in what God is having him accomplish? But secondly, there is also no doubt the possibility that God is frustrated with Moses because the people continue to cry out. We could plausibly read that Moses is failing to do something that ends up in this result. We could be asking, why are the people still scared and afraid and uncertain? Why have they not seen everything that God has done and had a little bit more trust in the outcome? How much more evidence do they need? I don't think that we have to resolve the question. In fact, I like both options and do not think one rules out the other. I see this dual possibility when I think about the accounts of Jesus' disciples after the resurrection, especially Thomas in John 20. Thomas, we remember, has been around Jesus throughout his ministry. While we do not meet him by name early on in the gospel, we do encounter him in John chapter 11, when Jesus is called to the home of a dying Lazarus, and again in John 14, where he is asking Jesus questions about the home that Jesus is going to prepare for his followers. In brief, Thomas has been around Jesus, present and active. The implication from where he has been says that he should have seen a good deal of what Jesus was doing and heard much of what Jesus was saying, at least enough to convince him that some mighty amazing things were happening in and around the person of Jesus. Yet still, after the resurrection, when Thomas just happens not to be behind the locked doors on the evening when Jesus first appears to the disciples, Thomas digs in when the others tell him that they have seen the Lord. He is stubborn in his refusal to believe the witness of others. In verse 25, he says, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." Consider Moses in this light. He has had direct encounters with God, and he has seen God's power at work in a series of signs that ultimately lead to the liberation of the people. Indeed, he, like Thomas, has had a front row seat to God in action. Moses, even to a greater extent, has actually been taking on a role in these events. He has been the one lifting up his staff, stretching out his hand, throwing dust in the air, or whatever else God asked him to do, and watching remarkable things happen each and every time. But here we are. Whether it is at the Red Sea or at the empty tomb, these men seem to be crying out to God, asking God for verification that God is who God is, and that what is happening is real and true and reliable. God responds in a way that should catch our attention both times. To Moses, there is a simple command: speak to the children of Israel. It is an imperative. The conversation should not be directed at me, God is saying. It should be directed to the people. Moreover, if you direct them, they will move forward. The verb here is nasai, which means to pull up, pull out, or go on a journey. They will break down the camp where they are right now and go forward. Now God is also going to give Moses 3 other commands. Lift up your rod and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. That is, it is not enough to just get the people moving. Moses also has to make a way for them to go forward. And God is telling Moses that Moses knows how to do that. In other words, when the people are complaining to Moses, Moses should know as their leader what to do. It reminds me of something that retired 4-star General Colin Powell, a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of State, once said about leadership, based on his many years of military experience. He said, "The day soldiers stop bringing you their problems is the day you stopped leading them. They have either lost confidence that you can help them or concluded that you do not care. Either case is a failure of leadership." God, in this verse, is reminding Moses that his job is to lead, to show the people that he hears their voices, their worries, but that there is still a way forward. The power to make extraordinary things happen is in Moses' hands. It's a lesson Jesus understands in John 20, because watch what he does. He, like God to Moses, gives Thomas a command. In fact, there are 5 commands. Jesus said to him, "Bring your finger here," and then instructs Thomas to touch where the nails had been driven into him. Jesus says, "Bring your hand to the side of me and put it in my side to feel where the spear went in." And then there is a last command. "And do not be doubting, but believing." Jesus needs Thomas, like all of the other disciples, to have confidence in what they know to be true, that Jesus is not in the grave anymore. It's not the easiest idea to swallow, but is it consistent with what they have seen and what they have heard when they were with Jesus all along? Thomas was there when Lazarus was raised. Is what is happening now like what they know of God? I am, however, arrested by one other detail in the Exodus passage. God goes on to say that when the parting of the Red Sea happens and when the Egyptians are defeated, that the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. That is, the great display that is about to unfold is not for the benefit of Moses. It is not for the benefit of the people of Israel. Rather, it is for the Egyptians to come to recognize God, a God who can overcome the power of their Pharaoh, a God who is acting on behalf of the once enslaved, a God who liberates, a God who takes the side of the less powerful. There's an assumption underlying that statement if you stop and think about it. The people of Israel, scared and tired and often reluctant when it comes to the things of God, and Moses, exhausted and feeling overmatched by his job. Well, both of these should know who God is and what to do to bring God's power into full view. Thus, while what is about to unfold at the Red Sea is advantageous to the people of Israel, it is not solely for them or about them. It is rather about a much larger project of God on this earth. Jesus is telling Thomas something quite similar. Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Look at that question Jesus poses. Is the source of your belief honestly because you were able to put your hands on my wounds? If it is, okay. But there are going to be many who do not have and will not need such a moment. They will trust in what you tell them, what you confess about what God is doing in Christ. They won't have to put their hands in any wounds. They will come to know God in their own experience, in their own ways, and their story will become part of the larger story of God across generations. The message that we are getting in both texts is that the forces of oppression and repression will not ultimately win the day. The military might of an Egypt or of a Rome can back the people of God into corners. It can drive them behind locked doors. It can threaten to annihilate. It can crucify. But with God, there is always liberation. There is always a way through and a new day. The Egypts and the Romes always come to an end. The people of God somehow always endure. Thus, when we stand at the Red Sea moments in our lives of faith, I think of God saying to Moses, "Why do you cry to me?" I think of Jesus asking Thomas, "Have you believed because you have seen me?" These questions should cut us to the quick. We need, to my mind, instead, to experience a kind of Abraham Lincoln moment. What do I mean by that? Let me share one story. Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in November of 1863 to be a part of the dedication of the cemetery there. This is an actual Matthew Brady photograph of that day, and here is Lincoln right in the center of it all. If you don't remember, the Battle of Gettysburg had been fought over the first 3 days in July, just 4 months previous to Lincoln's visit. At least 51,000 people had perished. 51,000. But it was, to Lincoln's mind, a turning point in the war. And he saw something more. Although he only spoke for some 2 minutes that day, and the reaction to his comments was split along political lines, Lincoln recognized that what they were marking there was not simply a battle. He said they could not consecrate that ground because the people who fought there had already done that work. But they could recognize, they could realize that what they fought for, liberty and equality, was an ongoing human struggle, and it was their responsibility, all of our responsibility, to remain committed to that cause. That's why this speech has become one of the most famous in American history. It is a message similar to what we should be hearing as people of faith. At the Red Sea, Moses is not to be crying out to God, and the people are not to stay camped, cowering at the Egyptians closing in on them. Moses is told to direct them forward. They are told to pull up stakes and to make a way. They are to do what seems impossible. Then the Egyptians will know, like all forces who oppose God will know, that God is a power that cannot be denied. And the people of Israel will do what they are supposed to do, be a light to other nations about who God is. In that room with the resurrected Lord, Thomas needs to come to terms with the reality of He is risen. He has to in order to go forward and testify to what he knows. Only then can the God of life be known to the whole world. These stories remind us of our responsibilities as resurrection people. We are not supposed to say, "I don't believe it unless I can see it." But the story I like best is that of Moses. Because, as we discussed, his life is one long tale of displacement, a saga of always being on the road. And in spite of feeling constantly unmoored, in spite of experiencing himself as betwixt and between peoples, in spite of being short-tempered and frustrated, he always manages somehow to do what God asks of him. If we want to be a resurrection people, a people dedicated to liberation and justice and life and hope, can we do anything less? Can we refuse to be on the journeys where God calls us to be? It's worth thinking about. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to being with you again next week.